Welcome back, everyone. You might remember a recent episode. We were talking about this big story that came out that as the different mayors across the United States were talking about defunding the police, they were using your taxpayer dollars to hire private security for themselves to keep themselves protected while removing your protection. And here to talk with us about that is the individual who helped break this story. It's Adam Andrzejewski. He's the CEO of Open the Books. And Adam, real pleasure having you on Crossroads.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me on the program, and thanks for your interest in our work. I think this is one of those stories where, politicians are being hypocrites. No new news, but the details are pretty interesting, and I think it serves a real educational value to go through it.
Being hypocrites with public safety, though, that's
Right.
a whole nother level of it. Yeah,
You're exactly right about that, because the number one public policy issue I'll submit is the resource allocation of taxpayer money to first responders and on public safety issues. So we can get into those details.
Yeah, well, I mean that's the most basic, that's the most basic function of government, is just having laws and protecting people's life, liberty, and property, basically.
Right.
That's the most basic function of government. And by doing this, they basically not only did away with that, but even obviously saw that maybe they themselves didn't feel safe because of what they'd done and wanted to keep themselves safe and use the taxpayer dollars that we give them for that purpose to protect themselves rather than the population.
These mayors have to answer one basic question, and they've got a lot of explaining to do on it. Since when is the police protection for the people, since when does that matter less than their own protection, right?
Yeah.
So, for instance, you've got in the city of Chicago, you've got Mayor Lori Lightfoot, and she says that she's against defunding the police. So at openthebooks.com, our auditors fact-checked her political rhetoric. And here's what we found. We found that in 2020, very quietly, she had cut the head count of rank-and-file police officers in the city by 400 positions. Now, take a step back. This didn't work out very well for former Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel. In the first term, Emanuel was elected in 2011, re-elected in 2015. In his first term, he had quietly cut 1,000 cops from the city payroll. Meanwhile, homicides spiked to where Chicago had over 750 homicides a year. And to put that in context, that was more in the city of Chicago than New York and Los Angeles combined. So this model's been tried before. In Chicago, when Lightfoot cuts 400 police officers during the pandemic, during the civil unrest in the city, she ramps up her own personal security detail to $3.4 million a year.
And this wasn't just something unusual. Okay, tell us let's start with the big picture first of what you found. And I want to get into the actual, on the ground examples of this. You talked about Lightfoot, let's talk about the rest, but give us the big picture first.
So the big picture is we took a look at the top 30 most populous cities in the country. 27 of them are run by Democrats, and there's 3 Republican mayors that run those cities. So first we started with the Republicans. Did they defund their police? And the answer to that is no. All 3 increased the dollars into their police departments or held serve. Then you got 27 Democratic mayors, and we found 25 Democratic mayors out of the 27 actually proposed or cut resources from the police department. They defunded their police. So what we did is we filed Freedom of Information Act requests wanting to know 2 things. How many officers are on the mayor's personal police protective detail, and how much did it cost taxpayers last year and each of the previous 5 years? And so we had responses from all 25 cities. 5 of them actually gave us the details, and 20 of them, after 10 weeks, we are still waiting to get the details on how much it cost and how many officers there are. So there's a big transparency problem. They're trying to hide the ball.
And so already what you found is pretty serious, but even then, that's just the tip of the iceberg probably, because you're still waiting for the rest of that. What steps are you taking to get that additional information on these other cities?
So they got back, all 20 of them, all 20 cities got back to us with a varying degree of timeline. So for instance, in some cities we have to wait till August. In other cities we have to wait till October to receive the production from them. So they're all blaming the COVID crisis for the lack of production to our sunshine request. I think it's absurd.
Yeah. Now, of the ones that did give you the data, what was the big picture that you saw?
A large ramp up and increase of taxpayer money used to protect the mayors while they defunded the police protection in the neighborhoods. So, for instance, like we just talked about, Chicago, in 2015, the cost of the executive protection detail in Chicago was about $2.7 million. Today, it's $3.4 million. In San Francisco, today versus 5 years ago, the mayor's personal protection for Mayor London Breed in San Fran costs $1 million a year more than what it did 5 years ago. Now, London Breed, she was behind defunding the police in San Francisco. They cut $120 million from the police budget. Now they have healthcare workers. They've redirected that money toward workforce job training and development. And the other thing that you need to know about San Francisco is they actually call their police officers peace officers.
Well, that's a normal statement. A lot of police officers call themselves that. Fair enough, but it's interesting though. Yeah. Now, in terms of the amount of money they're spending on their personal security, like what are the numbers here? What are we talking about?
So, for instance, like in Baltimore, they spent the most out of all 5 towns that have reported to us. So in Baltimore, they spent $3.7 million a year. In San Diego, they spent a little over $2 million a year in San Diego. Meanwhile, the mayor is a new Democratic mayor has back cuts to the police department of over $5 million in the city of San Diego. In New York, actually, the New York city government hasn't provided the details to us specifically on how much money Bill de Blasio, his wife, and his son, they get police details, how much that costs every single year. But when he ran for president, we do know the detail on that. Because of press reports, they spent in New York, his police detail followed him around the country when he was running for president, and they spent almost $400,000 for de Blasio's police detail during that period.
And so what is the big concern here, in terms of your perspective, like why, what does this really show us about why this matters?
So I think it goes right to that issue of hypocrisy. These mayors defunded the police coverage and protection in the neighborhoods, yet to an environment where they'll say that they came under increased threat, they ramped up their own coverage. So for instance, Chicago last summer was a very unsafe spot. Crime in the city has spiked to intermediate highs. In New York, homicides and shootings and robberies, they're up sharply. The crime's up sharply in all of these major cities. And yet, these mayors backed a public policy to strip public safety resources from the people while recognizing the threat to themselves. They loaded up the coverage for themselves. And I think that's why they need to explain their actions.
This is interesting. So, this is something that I was kind of thinking as well, I think what this really shows is that the mayors, by doing this, by defunding the police, were aware that it was going to cause safety issues. Otherwise, they would not need to hire new security details. And just to be clear, these were new security details, correct?
That's right.
Yeah.
They had over the course of the past 5 years, they've had security details, but they've added to them, and it's more taxpayer cost than ever before. That's what our data shows.
And so I think, in terms of holding them accountable, what can we actually do? Because it means that they recognize that their policies would make their cities less safe, is what I'm seeing here.
Right.
This does suggest a knowledge that what they were doing was going to make their cities less safe.
Right. I agree. And so, look, public opinion polls in these cities and across the country now show that defund the police is not backed by 70 to 80% of the American people. They think it's a crazy idea to defund the local police. So these mayors do as the crime rates continue to escalate in these cities where they have defunded and taken resources from the department, they're going to have and you see this in the New York primary for mayor. You've got a winner of that primary, it looks like, that held the line. And the primary said, we're not going to defund the police. We're going to provide the protection to the people. So maybe you're going to see a turn in public policy from these mayors in response to people leading the way. People need to lead on this issue.
Now, the other thing we're seeing is that you have groups the groups pushing for this defunding the police are typically the ones carrying out the rioting, getting behind the rioting. And it's in a very literal sense. So they talk about the inmates running the asylum. That's kind of what it is. That the people who are going out and rioting who don't want to be arrested are the ones pushing to have the police defunded. And it seems that the different politicians kind of just rolling on their backs and letting it happen.
Well, you have a variety of circumstances. So, for instance, you have a Democratic mayor, Michael Hancock, in Denver. So Hancock, last summer, this summer, in the national media, he'll say that he is against defunding the police in Denver. Okay, then on the other hand, you have the national media holding out Denver as the beta test primary example, success example for defunding the police. Because what did Hancock do? They're having mental health professionals respond to domestic mental health calls from citizens rather than the police. So on one hand, he says he's against defunding the police. On the other hand, he's the national beta test example on how to defund the police. And on Hancock's personal protection detail, we do have the dollars. Without benefits, it was $750,000 that Hancock had a personal police protective detail. With benefits, it's over $1 million a year to protect the Denver mayor.
Well, and the other interesting thing here is that a lot of these are anti-gun mayors. They're very much against guns, but they seem to see the need and having guns to protect yourself because they want to surround themselves with men with guns to protect themselves. It's another interesting chapter in all of this.
Well, that's a very good point. And specific to San Francisco, so you got London Breed, the mayor there, and we talked about her expensive police detail. It's nearly $1 million more today than what it was 5 years ago. And she stripped $120 million from the police budget and defunded her San Fran Police Department. Well, she's also put handcuffs on our police for many years. For example, at openthebooks.com, we know that there's about 8,000 homeless people in the city of San Francisco. And they have a problem because those homeless people are defecating on city streets. As a matter of fact, over a 9-year period, our auditors at openthebooks.com mapped 140,000 cases of human waste in the public way. And on our interactive map, and you can come to our website and take a look at this, we did use brown pins for each case. And the whole city is brown. There's a brownout in the Bay Area, and it's a human health catastrophe. So London Breed did not follow the window breakers theory of policing, where you arrest people on the small crimes, and that helps you prevent the big crimes. So this has been going on.
That's what cleaned up New York
back
under Giuliani, yeah. But go ahead, sorry.
So they're letting the small crimes flourish, and now we're seeing the big crimes flourish as well, this time with the defunded police department, but with London Breed diverting police resources into her own personal protective detail.
And I think the bigger picture here is what is the idea that what you're showing seems to suggest that they're doing this knowingly. Because, you could suggest that, okay, maybe they don't put two and two together, that if they allow these they basically legalize small crime and even sometimes medium crime, like legalizing theft under like $900-something in like San Francisco, for example, that by doing so, they're going to cause more crime, like serious crime. Now, you could say that maybe they don't put two and two together, that is going to lead to that. Maybe they don't look at previous policies. Maybe they disagree with the policies. They're like, oh, I don't believe that'll happen. We'll still be safe. What you showed is that they may not believe that. It doesn't seem they believe that because they would not need additional private security or police security if they actually believed that.
Well, your point's a very solid one. And it's, I never attribute bad policy to, I just think government is institutionally incompetent. But on this one, with so much scrutiny on public safety over the course of the last year and a half, every facet and allocation of the public safety first responder budget is completely thought through. So you're exactly right. On this issue, they know exactly how the pie and the resources are carved up.
In terms of public action, like lawsuits or anything like that, can anything be done about this?
Well, look, it's money is the mother's milk of politics. Definitely cut off the funding to these people, but it comes down to votes at the ballot box. That's the only thing that these mayors care about at the end of the day. It's personal power, it's campaign cash, and it's votes at the ballot box. That's the only thing that matters. So you got to bring the heat. If you're a citizen in one of these towns and a resident, you got to bring the heat so these mayors begin to see the light.
Now you're with Open the Books. You're still working on this part of the investigation. What else are you working on right now along these lines?
So at openthebooks.com, we'll come out with 200 investigations at the federal, state, and local level this year. At Real Clear Policy, every single day, you can find out the daily post at hashtag waste of the day. We put up an example of outrageous government spending. It's not only waste, but it's where government is literally ripping you off as the taxpayer. So some of those investigations that we've put up recently was like on Juneteenth. It was the new federal holiday. That became the 44th day of paid time off for a federal employee. The average federal employee now gets nearly 9 full work weeks of paid time off where they're paid to stay home. These are the kinds of things that we expose.
Now, can you give us a high-level view? I'd imagine from the standpoint of your organization and seeing in your position, seeing all the investigations you're doing. Now, I should step back a little bit because I know that with this recent investigation, you did take a nonpartisan approach to it. You looked at all the cities like this, and you looked at both the Republican ones, there's only a couple of them, and the Democrat ones, but you just found that the Republican ones didn't have this issue. Is this accurate, first of all?
That's very accurate. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. So, look, we only expose hard facts, and we don't care if they're Republicans or Democrats. Here's something that we exposed a couple of weeks ago on Republicans. 23 newly elected freshman members of Congress. It took Nancy Pelosi only 4.5 months to convert those quote-unquote fiscal conservatives that were elected in November of 2020 to take them from outsiders to bona fide Washington, D.C. insiders. When Pelosi floated the idea of bringing back earmarks, which is the currency of corruption in Congress, these 23 Republicans jumped on board. They were the swing vote on a secret vote in the Republican caucus where they voted to join Nancy Pelosi's pork barrel parade to bring back earmarks. Pelosi rewarded those 23 newly elected freshmen with nearly $400 million worth of earmark projects in the current House infrastructure bill.
Explain to us how these earmarks are the currency of corruption as you explain it.
So here's how, we're from Illinois. It is the Super Bowl of corruption. And we had a former Speaker of the House, Denny Hastert, and he was from Illinois. So here's how Hastert, as Speaker, worked earmarks. Hastert, his trust, bought a big piece of farm ground. A couple of years later, Hastert, as Speaker, earmarked a couple $100 million to put a road through his farm ground. Just as soon as that earmark was done, he flipped his farm ground for a massive $1 million plus profit. That's why we call earmarks the currency of corruption in Congress. You had, Jack Abramoff, the lobbyist, convicted of accepting bribes for earmarks with Republican members of Congress. You had Republican member of Congress from San Diego, California, Duke Cunningham. He was convicted. He spent time in federal prison. He was convicted for accepting bribes to put earmarks in legislation of, and this is pretty interesting, a yacht, a Rolls Royce, and a 20th century Louis Philippe commode.
Yeah, well, of course, necessary government spending, as we all know, right?
Those are the bribes he got by putting the earmarks in the legislation.
Interesting.
So that you can't police it. You can't make earmarks transparent and clean up the swamp in D.C. You just have to eliminate the practice. And so the late Dr. Tom Coburn, he's our former honorary chairman. He partnered with then President Barack Obama. They put an earmark ban in back in 2011 that held for 10 years. Pelosi brought it back, and she was successful in bringing it back because of 23 newly elected freshman Republican members of Congress.
So corruption's back in business, huh?
It is.
Yeah. Now, I guess just last question here. If you can, I'm sure you're seeing the whole picture of all of this. You're seeing everything we just discussed, which for most of us is like, wow, that's pretty crazy. But I'd imagine you're seeing probably 100 times more than this, at least. Give us the big picture of what you see as the issues with our government.
So you can't complain about Washington, D.C. and the corruption there until you have good government where you live. So here's what we know about public employee payrolls. There's 500,000 highly compensated six-figure federal employees. The number one most highly compensated is, of course, Dr. Anthony Fauci. And I wish he was a little bit better on the science. But at the local level, there's 1.7 million six-figure, $100,000 public employees. So the swamp for sure is in D.C., but 3 times the swamp is in your own backyards. So come to openthebooks.com, look up what people are making, even in your K through 12 school districts, and hold your local officials accountable for their spending.
Now, I want my viewers to get a bit more information on this, because I think this is important. Because I get a lot of people asking me, what can they do? What can they do? People ask me, what can they do? What do you tell them?
Right. Come to openthebooks.com and look at your local units of government. We make it very easy to search the payrolls, to search what your local units have conferred in lifetime pensions for retired public employees, and even checkbook spending. You can research it all right from our website, and then ask questions, demand answers of your public officials, and hold them accountable for their tax and spend decisions.
And so what are the usual action items when you find that there's something bad afoot, going on? What do you recommend they do?
Oftentimes when you ask your question, the demand of the answer, they'll want to run and hide. They won't answer your question. The demander of the answer will necessitate you asking that question in the public comment portion of their meeting. And then sometimes they still won't answer. So you alert the media. You network your friends and family into those meetings. We have put up to 500 citizens in those meetings before. That creates a media event. Typically, the media is with you. That process squeezes out waste, fraud, corruption, and taxpayer abuse. In Illinois, there's a pair of watchdogs that have executed on that model, and they have nearly 500 Illinois public officials that have fled their position in the face of their transparency.
Right. So I guess just, I said last question a bit ago, but I guess real last question now. If you'd tell our audience one thing, what would you tell them?
The American experiment, it rests on the individual. Reagan said it best when he left office in his speech to the American people. He said the American people are supposed to be the drivers of the car. We're supposed to tell our government how fast to go, when to turn, and when to stop. Now, right now, our bureaucrats, our public officials, they think we work for them. So we have to stand up. We have to execute on our rights, or we're going to lose our rights.
Great. Hey, Adam, openthebooks.com. Real pleasure having you on Crossroads.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you very much.